The old woman sniffs his hair for a long time, like a beast deciding whether to eat him or chase him away. Three men stand over him, armed with a stone knife and a spear made from a charred stick. And he understands only one thing. He has fallen into the Stone Age. And here, he is nobody. The first thing that hits him is the cold. The wet earth presses against his cheek. His fingers sink into the black humus up to his knuckles. The air smells of smoke, urine, and raw hide. Dan opens his eyes and sees three pairs of legs, slender ones wrapped in leather, children's bare feet, an old woman's with bulging veins, a skinny guy with a scorched face. The burn pulls the skin from his temple to his chin into a shiny scar. A girl of about 10 aims a spear at his throat, and the old woman with a stone knife holds it not as a weapon. She holds it calmly and with ease, like one would hold a spoon. Dan doesn't move. His mind works coldly and quickly. A deciduous forest, late spring, hides tanned with urine, a stone knife, a flake, unpolished, not metal. These people don't know what metal is. The thought washes over him like icy water into his lungs. He's in the Stone Age. And right now, a child is aiming a sharpened stick at his throat. And the child's face says, she's done this before. Dan slowly raises his open palms. No threat. He forces a crooked, pitiful smile. The old woman leans in, up close. There are so many wrinkles on her face that her skin looks like bark. She sniffs his hair. Then she straightens up and utters three guttural syllables with a clicking consonant. The girl lowers her spear. She doesn't put it away, she just lowers it. The guy steps forward and pokes Dan in the chest with his finger. It hurts. He grabs his hand, turns his palm upward. The skin is soft and white. No calluses, no scars, not a single trace of labor. The guy flings his hand back and hisses something at the old woman. Dan doesn't know the words, but the tone needs no translation. Weak, useless, a burden. The old woman turns and walks toward the smoke. The guy follows her. The girl stays behind. She stares without blinking. Dan stands up. His legs are unsteady. All around is a dense forest without a single sound of civilization. No roads, no airplanes, only birds, the wind, and the crackling of branches, and the smell of smoke. Dan follows the old woman. The girl is behind him. He feels the tip of a spear 3 steps behind his back. After 100 steps, the forest clears. In a clearing by a stream, there are 6 huts. The frames made of poles are covered with animal hides. There are about 25 people around. Women are scraping hides. 2 men are chipping away at stones. Children are playing in the mud. And everyone freezes when they see Dan. Every single one of them. A broad-shouldered man with a strand of gray hair raises his head. The chief. Dan realizes this immediately, from the way the others look at him before glancing at the stranger. The chief stands up. He circles around Dan. He feels the t-shirt. He rubs it between his fingers. He tugs at it. He tries to tear it. The fabric doesn't give way. The chief looks at the old woman. She says something long. The chief sizes Dan up again. Not hostile, not friendly, with the look of a man deciding whether it's worth feeding another mouth. Dan knows that look. He's seen it on foremen at construction sites. The question is simple. Is he useful or not? And an answer is needed quickly. Dan looks around. Women are carrying water in cracked gourds. Water leaks from the cracks, and only half of it reaches the huts. That's what he sees first. Not people, not weapons. Losses. A waste of resources at every turn. The engineer inside him wakes up before the man does. But right now, he's powerless. Not a word in their language, not a single tool, barefoot on foreign soil. The chief says something to one of the women. She grimaces but nods. That evening, Dan gets a spot by the fire, outside. They toss him a piece of hide and a bone with bits of meat still on it. Leftovers. A dog's share. He gnaws on it down to the last fiber and licks his fingers. The night is cold. He lies by the dying fire and looks up at the stars. He's never seen stars this bright. No lights, no satellites. A clear, peaceful sky without a single light bulb. And he thinks, calmly, without panic. He's an engineer. He's been solving problems for 10 years. Conditions. He's alive. He's in a world without metal, without wheels, without writing. Limitations. He can't speak. No tools. No status. Any child here is more useful. A resource. His mind. 300 years of the Industrial Revolution. The principle of the furnace. The principle of firing. The principle of smelting. If they don't kill him in the coming days, he'll build everything for them. Task number 1. Prove his worth. Quickly. Visibly. With something they can touch. He rolls over and looks at the stream. In the moonlight, the clay on the bank glistens. They walk on it every day. They carry water in it in leaky gourds and don't see what lies beneath their feet. He sees it. In the morning, Dan gets up before everyone else. He walks to the stream. He scoops up a handful of clay. He kneads it. The clay is rich and pliable. Good stuff. His hands remember dozens of pots from the reenactment festivals. He molds a pot the size of a fist. The sides are smooth. The bottom is flat. The rim is curved inward. He sets it on a rock to dry. He digs a hole with his hands. He lines the bottom with charcoal. He places the pot inside. He covers it with charcoal. He lights the fire. And he waits. A girl arrives first. She sits down 5 paces away. Her spear is nearby. Then the women. Then a guy with a sunburned face. They stand and watch as the stranger tosses twigs into the pit with the fire. Dan sits there for 6 hours. He keeps an eye on the heat. The coals must fire the clay but not crack it. He knows the principle, but every time it's a game of physics. By evening, the coals have burned out. Dan rakes the ashes with a stick. The pot lies at the bottom, red, hot. He lifts it, wrapping his hand in a hide. He taps it with his fingernail, a clear, ringing sound, a sound these people have never heard before. He scoops water from the stream. He pours it in. No water leaks out. Not a drop. Not a single crack. Dan turns to the people. 10 pairs of eyes. 20. He walks over to the old woman and holds out the pot. She takes it with both hands, holds it for a full minute, in silence. She looks at the water inside. Then she turns and goes into the hut. Silence. Everyone waits. A minute later, the old woman comes out. In her hand is a piece of dried meat, her own personal share, the one they give her every evening as the eldest, and which she has never shared with anyone. She places the meat at Dan's feet. She looks him in the eyes and utters 2 words. He doesn't know their meaning, but everyone understands the message. From that moment on, the stranger ceased to be a burden. He became the one who turned mud into a bowl. The next morning, Dan woke up to a kick. The guy with the scarred face was standing over him, pointing toward the forest. Then he made a gesture. He clenched his fist and struck the air from top to bottom. Work. Dan got up and followed him. In the forest, the men were chopping down thin trees with stone axes. Chopping was a strong word. They were pounding the trunks with a heavy stone tied to a stick with a leather strap. It took over an hour to fell a single tree as thick as an arm. Dan watched and kept count. The efficiency of the blow was about 5%. The stone didn't sit well on the handle. The leather strap absorbed half the energy. The angle of the blow was wrong. They were wasting their strength. But he said nothing. He couldn't explain it. He didn't know a single word. So he worked. He hauled branches. He helped drag the trunks back to camp. By noon, his hands were scraped raw, and his back was stiff as a board. The guy with the burn looked at his hands. He grunted. He tossed him a piece of rawhide to wrap around his palms. It wasn't a gift, it was a practical solution. An injured worker performs worse. Dan understood and appreciated that. In the evening, he sat by the fire next to Sana. The old woman was picking her teeth with a stick and staring at the fire. Dan picked up a stone from the ground. He showed it to the old woman. Then he pointed at the fire. Then at his little pot which was standing next to her hut. Stone, fire, pot. The old woman watched. Dan pointed to the ground by the stream. Clay. Then back at the pot. Then he spread the fingers of both hands. 10. He showed again. 20. He wanted to make 20 pots, but he needed clay. Lots of clay. He needed hands. Sana looked at him for a long time. Then she turned toward the fire and said a few words. The next morning, 3 women and the girl Mija came to Dan. They waited. Dan led them to the stream. He showed them what kind of clay to take. Rich, dark clay without sand. He showed them how to knead it, how to remove the pebbles, how to roll the clay into a rope between their palms. The women watched his hands and repeated the motions. Mija picked it up faster than anyone else. Her little fingers worked precisely and confidently. She didn't ask questions or wait for confirmation. She watched once and did it. By evening, they had 12 raw pots of various sizes. 3 of them were crooked. 2 were completely ruined, but 7 looked decent. Dan laid them out to dry under a hide canopy. 2 days later, he repeated the firing. Not in the same pit this time. He dug a larger pit, 3 times wider and deeper. He lined the walls with stones from the stream. The stones retained the heat and reflected the heat back toward the pots. The temperature inside was higher and more even. Of the 7 pots, 2 cracked. 5 came out intact. 5 pots in a single firing. The woman who had previously carried water in a leaky gourd was the first to receive a pot. She drew some water. She made it back to the hut. She didn't spill a single drop. She stood at the entrance and looked at the pot in her hands as if she'd been handed a crown. Dan began to learn the language. Every evening, he sat down next to Senna and pointed at objects. Stone. The old woman would say the word. Dan would repeat it. Wrong. The old woman corrected him. He repeated it again. Water. Fire. Hand. Foot. Tree. Meat. Fish. He found a stick and a strip of birch bark. He wrote down every new word. Not with letters. Letters didn't fit these sounds. He drew symbols. A triangle was a hut. A wavy line meant water. A circle with a dot meant fire. Next to them, he marked syllables with sticks as best he could. In the first week, he learned 30 words. In the second, 60. By the end of the first month, he understood simple phrases and could respond. Clumsily, like a child, but he could. Mija became his constant shadow. She came in the morning and left in the evening. She brought him clay. She tossed firewood into the firing pit. She sat silently beside him while he worked. She hardly ever spoke, neither to him nor to others. Dan noticed how people looked at her, as if she were a blank space, an orphan, an outsider. She'd turned up 2 years ago and had been living on the fringes ever since, just like him. Only she didn't have any pots to offer in exchange for a spot by the fire. He began to teach her, not with words, with his hands. He showed her how to knead the clay to drive out the air. Air inside the walls means cracks during firing. He showed her how to smooth the walls with wet fingers. He showed her how to check the thickness. Mija repeated the steps. Once, by the second day, she was shaping pots more evenly than he was. The shaman Harem watched. He sat by his tent, set apart from the others. His face was covered in tattoos, blue dots and lines running from his forehead to his chin. In his hands, he held a bundle of bones strung on a cord. He didn't approach Dan. He didn't speak to him. but he watched. Every time Dan pulled a new pot out of the pit, every time the women carried water in clay bowls instead of gourds, every time someone from the tribe went to the stranger instead of to him. Dan felt that gaze. He knew what it meant. He'd seen this dozens of times on construction sites. A man whose territory was shrinking. A man who was losing his monopoly. The shaman was the only one in the tribe who explained the world. Why it rains, why a child gets sick, why the fish had left the pit. He had answers to all questions. Spirits, the wrath of the ancestors, bad blood. Now a stranger had appeared who didn't talk about spirits. The stranger simply did things, and the things worked. That was more dangerous than any weapon. In the third week, Dan began building a stove. A real stove. Not a hole in the ground, but a structure. He found a spot on a hill behind the camp. The slope provided natural draft. The wind from the river blew from the bottom up the slope. If he positioned the stove so that the air intake faced down the slope, the air would be drawn in on its own. Free draft. He started with the foundation, stones from the stream, flat and heavy. He laid them in 2 rows, filling the gaps with clay mixed with straw. On top of the stones, he began building the walls, clay mixed with fine sand. Each layer was a palm's width high. Each layer had to dry before he laid the next one. It was slow, painfully slow. 3 days for the foundation, 4 for the walls, 2 for the vault. The vault was the most difficult part. He understood the principle of an arch, wedge-shaped elements that press against one another and don't collapse. But explaining this using only his hands and clay without a single precision tool was like explaining quantum physics with gestures. The first vault collapsed. Dan sat in front of the pile of wet clay and stared at it for 10 minutes. Then he stood up and started over. He built the second vault differently. He filled a hole with dirt and smeared clay over the top. When the clay dried, he scooped out the dirt from the inside. The result was a hollow dome, rough, uneven, but it stood. The first firing in the new kiln was a failure. The temperature fluctuated wildly. Every single pot inside burst. 12 pots, 3 days' work by 4 women. Dan stood there looking at the shards. The women stood behind him. He could feel their silence, their disappointment. Mija picked up a shard and ran her finger along the break. Dan crouched down next to her. He looked. The break was uneven. One side was more heavily fired than the other. Uneven heating. The kiln was heating from one side. He understood. The air inlet was too narrow. The air was flowing in a stream toward a single point instead of spreading out. He widened the air inlet. He added a clay partition inside so the airflow would split into 2 streams. Second firing. 10 pots inside. 6 hours of waiting. When he opened the kiln in the morning, 8 intact pots stood on the ground. 8 out of 10. Dan picked one up and tapped it. The sound was different, higher pitched and clearer than that of the first pot from the pit. The temperature had been higher. The firing was more intense. This pot was sturdier. He set it on a stone and struck it with another stone. The pot held up. The women watched. Mija watched. Chief Temu, who had come to see what all the commotion was about, stood with his arms crossed and watched. Dung lined up the pots. 8 of them. He turned to Temu and spoke his first sentence in the tribe's language. 4 words he'd been preparing for 3 days. He said he could make more. Temu looked at the pots, at the kiln, at the stranger with scraped hands and clay in his hair, and he nodded. The pots changed the camp faster than Dan had expected. A week after the second firing, every family in the tribe had 2 or 3 pots. The women no longer carried water in gourds. Meat was cooked in clay pots over coals instead of being roasted on sticks. Boiled meat is more tender. Boiled meat can be eaten by old people who have lost their teeth. Boiled meat can be given to sick children. It wasn't a revolution, it was a quiet shift, and Dan saw it in the little things. The old man who used to be fed separately, with stringy meat soaked in water, now ate from the communal pot along with everyone else. A child who used to vomit from half-raw fish now ate fish broth and didn't get sick. Senna poured her herbal infusions from a leaky leather bag into a pot, and the infusions became stronger because they didn't lose their potency to the air. Little things. But the little things added up. Dan kept track of time. He carved notches into a stick every morning. By the 30th notch, he spoke the tribe's language like a 3-year-old. By the 40th, like a 5-year-old. The structure of the language was simpler than he'd expected. Few abstractions, many concrete words. 20 words for different states of water. 3 words for snow. Not a single word for the future beyond the day after tomorrow. He wrote everything down on strips of birch bark using his own symbols. By the 40th day, he had more than 300 words and a rough grasp of grammar. That was enough to explain simple things and to listen. Listening was more important. He listened to Senna. The old woman knew every plant in the forest. She knew which root stops bleeding, which bark brings down a fever, which mushroom is poisonous, and which is edible if cooked properly. 50 years of experience in a single mind. No records, no system, no way to pass it on. When Senna dies, all of this will die with her. Dan began to write it down. Every evening after work, he would sit down with her and ask questions. He'd show her a plant. She'd tell him its name and its use. He'd draw a symbol for the plant on birch bark and symbols for its uses next to it. A leaf with 3 lobes. Next to it, a hand on the stomach. That meant it was for stomach pain. At first, Senna didn't understand what he was doing. Then she did. And then her eyes changed. She looked at the piece of birch bark with the drawings and touched it with her fingers. Dan could see that she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then she quietly uttered a word he already knew. Children. She said she'd had 4 children. They'd all died. 2 in the winter from the cold, 1 from a hunting wound, 1 daughter during childbirth. No one to pass the story on to. No one to tell it to. Dan placed his hand on the birch bark and said that now there was someone. Senna was silent for a long time. Then she continued talking about the herbs, but her voice trembled. Dan didn't mention it out loud. In the 6th week, the first problem arose. Not from the shaman, from the weather. It rained non-stop for 4 days. The stream swelled and burst its banks. The water flooded 2 huts. The oven got soaked. The clay in the walls softened, and the right side caved in. Dan stood in the rain and looked at his oven. 2 months of work. He clenched his teeth. Then he relaxed them. Then he went to look for stones. When the rain stopped, he rebuilt the oven. He didn't just repair it, he rebuilt it. This time, he made the foundation higher. He raised the base by 3 rows of stones instead of 2. He made the walls thicker. He added a canopy of poles and animal hides over the oven so the rain wouldn't hit the vault. Mija helped. She hauled stones from the stream silently and without stopping. Dung noticed that she had grown stronger over these weeks. Hands that had barely been able to hold a spear now moved stones the size of a head. Work changed people. He knew this from construction sites. People who build become different. They think differently. They see the results of their own labor, and something inside them straightens out. The 6th week brought something else as well. Strangers arrived at the camp, 2 men and a woman from a tribe upstream. They hadn't come to fight. They'd come to watch. Word of the clay pots had reached their neighbors. Temu welcomed them by the campfire. The guests sat and looked at the clay bowls in which boiled fish had been served. They ran their fingers along the sides. They tapped the bottoms. They exchanged glances. Then one of them pointed at Dan and said something to Temu. Dan couldn't make out the words, but he saw the chief's reaction. Temu frowned. He shook his head. He said something sharp. The guests left the next morning. That evening, Dan asked Sena what they wanted. The old woman replied with a single word: exchange. They wanted to trade Dan. They offered 2 young women and 5 deer hides for the stranger who made pots. Temu refused, but Dan saw how the chief looked at him after the conversation. Differently, appraisingly, as if he were an object that had risen in value and now needed to be protected or sold for a higher price. Dan understood. He needed to become not an object, but a person. Not a valuable slave, but a part of the tribe. To do that, he needed something more than just pots. He needed to make a gesture. The next day, he got up before everyone else. He went to the kiln. He fired 5 pots that day, the best ones he'd ever made. Even walls, smooth bottoms, a delicate ring when tapped. In the evening, he brought them to the communal fire. He lined them up in front of the chief, and he spoke. It was his first long speech in the tribe's language, stilted, hesitant, accompanied by gestures and drawings made with a stick on the ground. He said the pots weren't his. The pots belonged to the tribe. He wouldn't take them with him when he left, because he wasn't going to leave. He said he wanted to stay, not as a prisoner, nor as a bargaining chip, but as a person who works and eats alongside everyone else. He said he had more knowledge, a great deal of knowledge. He could build a house that wouldn't let in rain. He could prepare food that wouldn't spoil all winter long. He could build walls that the wind couldn't break down. But to do that, he needed time, and he needed them to stop being afraid of him. Temu listened. The tribe listened. The shaman, Harem, stood in the shadows beyond the circle of light and listened as well. When Dan fell silent, the chief sat motionless for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked over to Dan and placed a hand on his shoulder. One word. Dan didn't know it, but Senna, standing nearby, exhaled quietly, and that told him everything. He had been accepted, not as a guest, not as a slave, as a member of the tribe. That night, Dan lay on a hide by the fire, for the first time, not outside. They had given him a place in Senna's tent. Small, cramped, it smelled of smoke and dried grasses, but it was under a roof. He looked up at the dark ceiling of animal hides and thought, pots are good. Pots mean survival. But winter would come in 4 months. It would be cold in these huts in winter. Drafts would blow through every crack. The fire in the center gave off smoke that stung his eyes. The heat escapes upward through the smoke hole. The children will freeze. The elderly will freeze. 1 in 5 children won't survive the winter. Senna had already told him that. 1 in 5. He repeated it to himself in the darkness. 1 in 5. Tomorrow he'll start building a dugout. He began digging the dugout the next morning. He chose a spot on the southern slope of the hill above the camp. The southern slope gets more sun in winter. A slope provides natural drainage. Water won't pool inside, but will drain down through the soil. He measured out the area with his steps. 4 steps by 3. Small. Enough for a family of 4. A rectangle. That was important. All the shelters in the camp were round. A circle is easier. Just stick in some sticks and tie them together at the top. But a rectangle is more efficient. More usable space with the same walls. Less wasted space in the corners. Dan knew that none of them would understand this until they saw it. So he just dug. He dug with his hands and a digging stick he begged from the women. A heavy stick with a charred end. It was good for digging up roots. It was completely useless for digging a foundation pit. By lunchtime, he dug down an elbow's depth. His hands were covered in blisters. His back wouldn't give way. People were watching him. The men by the fire watched and didn't interfere. The women watched and whispered among themselves. He's digging a hole. Why is a stranger digging a hole on the hill? Mija came by in the afternoon. She looked, she left. She returned an hour later with another digging stick. She sat down beside him and began to dig, silently. Dan nodded to her. They dug until dark. By evening the next day, a young man with a scarred face joined them. His name was Bekho. By then, Dan already knew the names of everyone in the tribe. Bekho wasn't a hunter. A burn from a campfire in his childhood had disfigured his face and left hand. His left hand didn't bend well. He couldn't throw a spear and couldn't pull a bowstring. In a tribe of hunters, that meant the lowest place in the hierarchy, below the women, below the children. He ate last and slept at the entrance to the hut, where the draft was strongest. But he was strong, and he knew how to work. Dan saw this on the first day when Bekho was hauling logs in the forest. With his one good arm, he maneuvered logs that two others could barely lift. Bekho didn't ask why they were digging the pit. He just dug. Because work was the only language he spoke fluently. In 5 days, they dug a pit waist deep. Dan built the walls with an outward slope so the earth wouldn't crumble. He packed the bottom with stones. Then they started on the walls. Logs. Thin trunks driven vertically into the ground around the perimeter of the pit. The space between them was packed with clay mixed with straw. The technique was crude. Dan knew that this was how mud huts had been built for thousands of years. The clay would dry, it would harden, it would retain heat and keep the wind out. He made the roof out of poles laid at an angle. Straw on top, clay over the straw. Straw again over the clay. 3 layers. Rain wouldn't get through 3 layers. But the most important part was inside, the chimney. That's what set the dugout apart from a hut. In huts, the fire burned in the middle. The smoke rose upward and escaped through a hole in the ceiling. The hole let the smoke through. The hole let the cold through. The hole let the rain and snow through. People lived in a constant cloud of soot. Their eyes stung. Their lungs wheezed. The children coughed all winter long. Dan built a small stove out of stones and clay in the corner of the dugout. It wasn't very tall, knee-high. It had a firebox in the front and an opening in the back. From the opening, he ran a pipe made of fired clay. It took him 4 days to make the pipe. He molded sections a cubit long and fired them in a large kiln. He joined the sections together, sealing the seams with clay. The chimney ran from the stove up the wall and exited through the roof. Smoke up the chimney, warmth in the room. A principle that's 4,000 years old and one these people don't know. The first firing. Dan shoveled dry branches and small kindling into the firebox. He lit it. The fire caught. Smoke rose up the chimney. Not into the room, up the chimney. A thin wisp of white smoke rose from the clay chimney above the roof. Inside the dugout, the air remained clean. The stove gave off heat. The stones stored the heat and released it slowly, hour by hour. Dan sat inside on the packed earthen floor and simply breathed. Clean, warm air, free of soot. He closed his eyes. He felt good. For the first time in 2 months, he felt truly good. Bekho stood in the doorway and looked inside. His face. Dan memorized his face at that moment. The eyes of the sunburnt guy who had spent his whole life sleeping at the entrance to a drafty shack grew wide and wet. He stepped inside. He crouched down by the stove. He held his hands out toward the warmth, and he sat there for an hour without saying a word. By evening, the whole camp had stopped by the dugout. Temu came. He leaned in through the doorway. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the stove, the chimney. He touched the warm stones with his palm. He stood there for a moment. Then he stepped out. He looked at Dan and said 2 words. Dan already understood enough. The chief said one more. Dan nodded. Then he held up 5 fingers. 5 dugouts. By winter. Temu raised an eyebrow. He looked at his own hands, then at Dan's. 3 men. It took 5 days to dig a pit. It took 12 days to build 1 dugout. 5 is 60 days. 4 months until winter. Dan held up 10 fingers. Then he gestured toward the men. If you give me 10 hands, I'll make it in time. Temu hesitated. 10 hands meant 5 men. 5 men not out hunting meant 5 fewer men to provide meat. Dan saw that arithmetic in the chief's eyes, and he understood it was correct. He couldn't demand it, he could only show. He pointed to the dugout. He pointed to the children playing by the stream. He pointed to the sky. Then he wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. Winter, children, warmth. The message was simple. Temu assigned him 3 men, Baekho and 2 young men who weren't the best hunters. Not 5, 3. Dan accepted. He broke the work down into stages. Baekho dug. He dug faster and deeper than anyone else. The 2 young men hauled stones and mixed clay. Dan directed and built the walls. Mi-ja prepared sections of pipe on a large stove. An assembly line. A rough, primitive assembly line of 4 people. But it worked. The second dugout went up in 9 days instead of 12. The third in 8. They were learning. Their hands memorized the movements. The stones were laid more precisely. The clay was mixed more correctly. The joints were tighter. Dan didn't give orders. He demonstrated. Once. Then he stepped back and watched. If he pointed his finger crookedly, if he nodded approvingly, he'd worked exactly the same way on construction sites in Seattle. No need to say much. You just have to set the standard. The 4th dugout was built almost entirely without him. Baekho staked out the site himself, chose the spot himself, checked the slope himself. Dan stood to the side and smiled for the first time in all this time. Not because everything was going well, but because Baekho was thinking. He was making decisions. He had become a builder. Dan hadn't made him a knife or given him a weapon. He'd given him a job where a burned hand didn't matter. Where it wasn't 2 hands that counted, but the head. Baekho understood this, and he straightened up, literally. He walked more upright. He looked people in the eye. He didn't eat last. He ate with the crew, because the crew ate together. That was Dan's rule. Those who work together, eat together. Temu didn't object. By the end of the 3rd month, 4 dugouts were standing. A 5th was under construction. The families who had moved into the first 4 no longer wanted to return to their tents. It was warm in the dugout at night. The smoke went up the chimney. The children slept without coughing. The women dried herbs and meat on the warm stones of the stove. It was better. Everyone could see that it was better. And the shaman, Heidan, saw it too. The shaman struck in the night, not with a knife, with a word. Dan woke up to a scream. Heidan was standing in the center of the camp by the communal fire. The entire tribe had gathered around. It was dark, and in the firelight, the people's faces looked like masks. Haran spoke quickly. Dan didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. The stranger had brought the wrath of the spirits. The stranger is building houses in the ground. The land belongs to the dead. The living must not burrow into the land of the dead. The spirits are displeased. The spirits will send disease. The spirits will send famine. The spirits will take the children. Haran shook a bundle of bones above his head, and his voice rose higher and higher. He was a good orator. He knew his tribe. He knew that the easiest way to move these people was through fear for their children. Dan stood at the entrance to Senna's hut and listened. Senna stood beside him. Her face was tense. She placed her hand on his elbow. She wasn't pushing him away. She was holding him back. Don't interfere. Wait. Temu sat by the fire. The chief's face was stony. He didn't interrupt the shaman. In this world, the shaman spoke to the spirits. and the chief spoke to the people. To interrupt the shaman would be to say that the spirits weren't important. No chief would ever do that. Haran spoke at length.
Then he fell silent. Silence.
The fire crackled. Children cried in their tents. Temu looked at Dan. Everyone looked at Dan. He had to say something, right now, in a language he knew as well as a 5-year-old, against a man who had spoken it his whole life. Dan stepped toward the fire, slowly. He sat down across from the shaman. He looked him in the eye. Haran was older and stronger. His tattooed face showed nothing but a steady, cold hatred. Dan spoke, quietly. He didn't try to shout or argue. He said he could hear the shaman. He said he respected the spirits. Then he asked, one sentence, simple. Last winter, how many children didn't wake up? Silence. He repeated, how many children? A woman in the third row sniffled. Senna quietly answered for everyone. 4. Last winter, 4 children froze to death. Dan nodded. Then he pointed toward the dugouts on the hillside. Dark, low silhouettes against the starry sky. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the chimneys. It's warm inside. It's dry inside. Inside, the children slept without coughing. He said that if the spirits wanted the children to live, then the spirits wouldn't object to warm homes. And if the spirits wanted the children to die, then maybe it was worth asking the spirits why. It was risky, he knew that. He was essentially saying that the shaman was either lying or speaking on behalf of evil spirits. But he phrased it gently, through a question. Not an accusation, but a question. Heidan flushed. Even in the light of the campfire, you could see the blood rushing to his face beneath his tattoos. He opened his mouth to answer, and at that moment, Hanil stood up. The chief's daughter. Dan had seen her before, but had never spoken to her. Tall. Taller than most of the men in the tribe. Lean and quick. A scar across her left eyebrow. A braid down to her waist. A sling on her belt. She wasn't looking at Dan or the shaman. She was looking at her father, and she said one sentence. My brother froze to death 2 winters ago in a hut by the fire. Silence. A heavy, thick silence. Temu closed his eyes. For a second. For 2. Then he opened them. He stood up. He turned to the shaman and said 3 words. Dan didn't understand them, but Heidan did. He stood there for a second. 2. Then he turned and walked off into the darkness. Not toward his own hut. Into the forest. In the morning, Haran returned. He sat by his hut and said nothing. No one approached him. No one asked him anything. But no one chased him away either. Dan approached him closer to noon. He brought a pot of hot water with herbs that Senna had gathered. Heidan didn't take it. Dan set the pot at his feet and left. An hour later, the pot was empty. Dan chose not to notice. A week passed. The shaman didn't attack. He didn't speak to anyone. He sat by his hut and carved bones. Dan continued to work. The 5th dugout was finished. He started on the 6th. The camp's food supplies were dwindling quickly. The hunters were bringing back less meat than usual. Game was moving away from the river. The fish in the pits were getting smaller. Winter was approaching, and supplies were running low. Dan thought about this every evening. The pot solved the problem of water storage. The dugouts would solve the problem of warmth. But food was another matter. He sat by the stove and laid out sticks on the ground. Each stick represented a mouth. 26 mouths in the tribe. 26 mouths every day for 4 winter months. 120 days. Meat, fish, roots, nuts. Roughly speaking, in terms of dried meat, they'd need about 20 kilograms per person per month. 26 people, 4 months, 2,000 kilograms, 2 metric tons. They didn't even have half that much. Salting, smoking, drying. 3 ways to preserve food for the winter. The tribe knew how to dry food. They air-dried meat in the sun and wind. But air-dried meat spoiled quickly. It became covered with mold. Worms would appear after a month. They lost a third of their supplies before midwinter. Dan knew how to fix that. Smoking. Proper smoking. Not just holding the meat over a campfire, but a long, cold smoking process in an enclosed space at a low temperature. A smoke chamber. He drew it with a stick on the ground that evening by the light of the campfire. Yun-Ah hadn't come into his life yet, and there was no one to explain complicated things to him, so he drew it. A rectangle. Below, a campfire off to the side. A groove running from the fire to the rectangle. Smoke travels along the groove. The smoke cools as it travels through the groove. Cold smoke enters the cabinet from below. Meat hangs at the top. The smoke envelops the meat and escapes through a hole at the top.
Beko looked at the drawing, then at Dan, then back at the drawing. He pointed to the groove and asked why. Dan explained it step by step. Hot smoke cooks the meat. Cold smoke dries the meat. Smoke-dried meat keeps for a long time. A very long time. Beko nodded. The next day, they began building. The smokehouse was simpler than a dugout. A fire pit 5 steps from the frame. A groove 4 steps long. A palm's width deep. Covered on top with flat stones and clay. A frame made of clay-coated poles. Inside, horizontal sticks for hanging the meat. There was a hole at the top with a stone damper. It took 3 days to build. The first batch, 10 strips of venison. The fire was made of alder wood. Alder produces a mild smoke without any bitterness. Dan knew this from his blacksmithing hobby. He smoked meat in a homemade smokehouse in a friend's garage every summer. The smoke flowed through the groove. Cool, gentle smoke filled the cabinet. The meat hung in that smoke for 3 days. Dan changed the firewood every 4 hours. Mija helped at night. On the 4th day, he took the meat down. The strips were dark. Firm. They smelled of smoke. He broke off a piece and tasted it. The flavor was strong and deep, 10 times richer than ordinary jerky. He let Senna try some. The old woman chewed for a long time. Then she looked up and said one word. Good. But the real test was still ahead, in a month, in 2. If the meat didn't spoil by midwinter, he'd have succeeded. Dan put the smoked meat in a pot with a lid and placed it in the darkest corner of the dugout. He checked on it every week. After 2 weeks, no changes. After 3, the same. No mold, no worms, no smell of rot. He began smoking everything the hunters brought back. Venison, fish, wild boar meat. The smokehouse ran non-stop. Mija tended the fire during the day. Beko gathered firewood. Dan oversaw the process and taught them. By the end of the 4th month, the 6 dugouts were filled with pots packed with smoked meat and fish. Not 2 metric tons, far from 2 metric tons, but more than in any previous winter. Dan stood in front of the 6th dugout and looked up at the sky. The clouds were heavy and low. The wind was blowing from the north. The first snow would fall in a couple of weeks. He wasn't ready. But he was more ready than he had been yesterday, and tomorrow he would be more ready than he was today. That was the only thing he could promise himself. Mija stood nearby. Her hands were covered in clay. Her face was smudged with soot. She had grown over these past months. Not physically, inside. She looked at him and waited for him to speak. Dan pointed to the pots of smoked meats. Then at the sky, then at her. And he said, "We'll get through this." Mija didn't smile. She rarely smiled at all. But she nodded. And that nod was enough. The first snow fell in the 5th month. Dan stood at the entrance to Sena's dugout and watched as white flakes settled on the black earth. It was quiet. There was no wind. The snow fell steadily and thickly, and by noon, the camp was white.
The temperature had dropped sharply. Overnight, the world had changed. The water in the stream was covered with a thin crust of ice along the banks. The ground beneath his feet rang with a faint chill. Breath hung in the air like a white cloud. 6 dugouts stood on the hillside, dark mounds beneath the snow. Smoke rose from their clay chimneys. It was warm inside. Inside, children slept under animal skins on warm cots by the stoves. But 4 families were still living in tents. 4 families for whom there weren't enough dugouts. Dan hadn't made it in time. He knew he wouldn't make it in time. He'd counted the days and the workers, and knew that 4 months and 3 workers meant 6 dugouts at most. Math doesn't lie. But knowing and feeling are 2 different things. He watched as a woman from a tent carried a child wrapped in 3 layers of animal skins. The child's face blue from the cold. And he felt something twist inside him. Temu made his decision quickly. The families from the tents were crammed into the dugouts. Instead of 4 people in each, there were now 6 or 7. It was cramped, stuffy, but warm. The tents remained for storage and for the men who stood guard at night. Dan moved from Senna's dugout to one of the tents. He gave up his spot to a family with 2 children. Senna tried to object. He shook his head. The children came first. The first 2 weeks of winter were bearable. It was snowing, but the frosts were mild. The hunters still went out into the forest. They brought back little, but they brought something. They took out the smoked meat from the pots little by little. Dan kept track of their consumption. Every evening he counted. Sticks on the ground. Each stick represented a day's worth of supplies. By the start of the 2nd week, he realized their supplies would last 2.5 months. Winter lasts 4. A shortfall of 1.5 months. He sat by the fire and looked at the sticks. Mija sat next to him and looked at them too. She already understood his counting system. She couldn't count past 10, but she could see that there were few sticks and many days left. Dan began to think about fish. The stream had frozen along the banks, but the water still flowed in the middle. Further downstream, the stream flowed into the Tail River. The river was wider, deeper. In winter, the fish went deep, but didn't disappear. They stayed in pits at the bottom, slow and sluggish from the cold. If you could reach them, you could catch them. The tribe didn't fish in winter, never. The water was cold. Your hands went numb. Nets made of plant fibers would tear from the ice. It was impossible. For them. Not for Dan. He knew about the vershi, a woven trap made of twigs. The fish swims in through a funnel, but can't get out. The design is very simple. He'd seen them in museums and at festivals. He'd made them himself out of willow twigs. Willows grew in abundance along the stream. The twigs bent even in winter if you soaked them in warm water first. In a pot. In a clay pot by the stove. The chain of ideas came together. A pot to heat water, warm water to make the twigs pliable, pliable twigs for a fish trap for fish, fish for survival. Each invention led to the next. Dan wove his first fish trap in 2 days. It was rough, crooked. It looked like a pot-belly basket with a funnel inside. He carried it to the river. The river was a half-hour walk from camp. He found a spot near the bank where the water was deep and the current slow. He lowered the trap to the bottom. He weighed it down with stones so it wouldn't drift away. He put a piece of smoked fish inside as bait. He returned the next morning. There were 3 fish in the trap, small ones, each about the size of his palm. But 3 fish overnight without any effort, without standing in the icy water, no torn nets. 3 fish that lay in a pot of hot water in the morning and by noon had become hot soup for 7 people. Dan wove 4 more traps. He set them in different holes along the river.
Every morning he made his rounds. Every morning, 5 to 10 fish. That wasn't enough for everyone, but it was a bonus. Every fish meant one more day that didn't have to be taken from their supply of smoked meat. He taught Bakho how to weave traps. Bakho worked with one hand and his good shoulder, the rods bent with great effort. Bakho's first trap was clumsy, and a fish could have swum right out of it with ease. The second one was better. The third one worked. Within a week, Bakho was making traps faster than Dan. His single arm was stronger and more precise than Dan's two arms. Winter was bearing down. The frost grew more intense with each passing week. By the 6th week, the temperature had dropped so low that the water in the pots would freeze overnight if not kept by the stove. The stream froze over. Ice bound it from bank to bank. The women chipped away at the ice with stones to fetch water. Dan counted their losses. Food was running out. The smoked meats were melting. The fish from the ice holes were getting smaller and fewer. The river was freezing over farther and farther from the shore. Soon the verse would be frozen solid, and it would be impossible to reach them. In the 7th week, a child fell ill. A 2-year-old girl from the family living in the 3rd dugout. A fever, a hot forehead, dry, cracked lips. Her mother held her in her arms and rocked her. Head-On came over. He crouched down beside them. He took out his bones, shook them, whispered. Placed the bone amulet on the girl's chest. Left. The child continued to burn with fever. Dan found out by evening. Senna told him. The old woman's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. She had seen this many times. Fever, dehydration, death on the 3rd day. Every winter, every year. 4 last year, 3 the year before. She'd gotten used to it. No. She hadn't gotten used to it. She just learned not to show it. Dan went to the dugout. The mother didn't want to let him in. She looked at him with hatred and fear. A stranger, a man, standing near her sick child. Senna came in with him. She said something quietly. The mother stepped back. Dan crouched down. He looked at the girl, a tiny body wrapped in furs. Hot, dry. Her lips were chapped. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Dehydration. He knew. He'd read about it. Oral rehydration. The simplest and most effective medicine in human history. Water, salt, sugar. He didn't have any sugar, but he had honey. Senna kept a small pot of wild honey in her hut. She'd gathered it little by little over the summer. She'd treasured it like a precious gem. Dan asked for it. Senna didn't hesitate for a second. She brought the whole pot. Dan boiled water in an iron kettle. No, he didn't have an iron kettle yet. In a clay pot. He placed the pot on the coals of the stove in the dugout. The water came to a boil. He took the pot off the heat. He waited until it cooled to lukewarm. He added a pinch of salt. Salt was scarce in the tribe. Grains of gray rock salt that they traded for at a terrible price with the mountain tribes. Just a pinch, then a drop of honey. He stirred it with a stick. He tasted it. Slightly salty, slightly sweet, warm water. A rehydration solution. In his world, a packet like this cost 10 cents and saved millions of children a year. Here, no one knew about it. He lifted the girl, carefully. Her little hot head rested on his arm. He brought the rim of the pot to her lips. The girl didn't drink. Her lips were pressed tight together. He dipped his finger in the solution and ran it along her lips. A drop fell into her mouth. The girl swallowed. He did it again. Another drop. Another. Drop by drop, slowly, patiently. Her mother stood nearby. Senna stood nearby. The tribe had gathered at the entrance to the dugout. They were silent. Harem stood in the back row. His face was unreadable. 3 hours. Dan had been giving the girl water for 3 hours, drop by drop. His arm had gone numb. His back ached. His knees burned from the hard earthen floor. He didn't move. A drop. Another drop. By midnight,
The girl opened her eyes. She looked at him. She didn't cry. She looked at him and closed them again. But her forehead had grown slightly cooler, just a little. He kept going, until morning. When sunlight streamed through the doorway, the girl's forehead was warm but not hot. She was asleep, peacefully and deeply. Her mother took her from Dan's arms, held her close, looked at Dan. He stood up. His legs wouldn't obey him. His knees creaked. He stepped out of the dugout into the frosty dawn. The tribe was standing outside. Everyone who could stand. They had waited all night. Dan looked at them and nodded. She's alive. A woman in the crowd began to cry. Then another. Then a man turned away and covered his face with his hand. Dan walked through them to his tent. He lay down on the animal hide. He closed his eyes. He was shaking. Not from the cold, from what he had just done. With water, salt, honey. 3 things that had always been here, that lay right at his feet, that were free and simple. And children died every winter because no one knew. He was shaking and couldn't stop. 3 days later, the girl was sitting by the stove eating fish soup. The girl's mother came to Dan, silently. She placed a wedding bracelet in front of him, her only piece of jewelry, braided from sinew with 3 bone beads. Dan picked up the bracelet. He looked at it. He shook his head and held it out to her. The woman didn't take it. She went to Sana and said, "Tell him, we're his people now, all of us, forever." Sana relayed the message. Dan stood there with the bracelet in his hand, not knowing what to say. He placed it back in the woman's hands, and he said he didn't need the bracelet. He needed her to teach the other mothers how to make this solution. Water, salt, honey. 3 things every mother must know. The woman nodded. After that night, there wasn't a single person in the tribe who doubted Dan. Not a single one. Even Heiran remained silent. Winter dragged on. Long, dark, cold. Supplies were running out. The mountain peaks were frozen solid by the 10th week. Hunting became impossible. The snow was waist deep. The reindeer had retreated to the mountains. The tribe ate smoked meat, then roots, then bark. Dan was losing weight. Everyone was losing weight. But no one died. 14 weeks of winter. 14 weeks of cold and hunger and dark days when the sun would appear for 3 hours and then disappear again. And no one died. Not a single child, not a single old person. For the first time in Sana's memory, for the first time in her 55 winters. When the first stream began to gurgle beneath its icy crust in early spring, Sana sat at the entrance to the dugout and wept, quietly and silently. Dan sat down beside her. He didn't ask. He knew. She was crying because everyone was alive, because this had never happened before. Spring arrived wet and boisterous. The snow melted quickly. Streams turned into torrents. The Tail River swelled and burst its banks. The water crept up to the lower huts, and Temu ordered the camp to be moved higher up the slope, closer to the dugouts. Dan stood on the hill and looked out over the valley. Green shoots were pushing through the brown grass from the previous year. The birds had returned. The air smelled of earth and freshness. He was alive. They were all alive. And he finally had hands. Winter had changed the dynamics within the tribe. Those who had survived the winter in the dugouts with stoves and a supply of smoked meat looked at Dan differently, not as a curiosity, as a necessity. Temu gave him 10 people, not 3, 10. 5 men and 5 women. Bekho became the foreman of the construction crew. Mija oversaw the firing and pottery production. 4 women molded pots under her supervision. Dan began making bricks, real bricks, using clay mixed with straw in a wooden mold. He carved the mold from 2 flat pieces of wood bound together with straps, a rectangle. Fill it with clay, tamp it down, remove the mold, leave it to dry. After 3 days in the sun, the brick had hardened. Then it was fired in the kiln. The fired brick was hard as stone, red, resonant, uniform. Each brick was just like the one before it. One size, one shape. You can build walls out of identical bricks. Smooth, straight walls that don't collapse or warp. The women molded 30 bricks a day. 3 days to dry, 1 day to fire. After 2 weeks, Dan had more than 200 bricks. He began building his first house. Not a dugout, a house. With a stone foundation. With brick walls set in clay mortar. With a roof of poles covered with straw and clay. With a window. A real window. An opening in the wall filled with thin sheets of mica that Dan found among the rocks by the river. The mica let in light, but kept out the wind and rain. A dim, yellowish light, but light nonetheless. For the first time in their lives, these people could sit inside a house with the door closed and see without a fire. The house took a month to build. Dan gave it to a family with 3 children, the largest family in the tribe. The mother stepped inside. She ran her hand along the brick wall. Even, smooth, warm from the sun. She looked at the window. A beam of light fell on the earthen floor, and dust swirled within that beam. She stood there, watching the dust and the light, unable to look away. Dan had seen faces like this on construction sites when clients first entered their new homes. The expression was always the same, in Seattle and in the Stone Age. My home. In the 3rd month of spring, Dan found copper ore. He'd been looking for it since day 1. Every time he went to the river or into the woods, he'd look at the rocks. Green streaks on the surface, malachite spots, copper oxide. He knew what it looked like. He'd seen samples in museums and at festivals. He'd read descriptions. But it's one thing to read and quite another to kneel by a rocky outcrop on a hillside and scrape away the green patina on the brown stone with his fingernail, and to feel his heart pounding in his throat. Copper. It was copper. He brought the stones back to camp, 3 pieces, each the size of a fist. He placed them next to the kiln and sat watching them all evening. He thought. A traditional pottery kiln wouldn't work for copper. Copper's melting point is 1,080 degrees. His pottery kiln could reach at most 800. He needed more. He needed forced airflow. Bellows. Air forced into the combustion chamber. More air means more oxygen. More oxygen means a higher temperature. He'd seen bellows at festivals, a leather bag with 2 wooden handles, squeeze and blow. A very simple device, but he needed leather, a single unbroken piece without any holes, a large one. He went to Hanil. The chieftain's daughter looked at him with the same skepticism as before, but now without contempt. That winter, she'd seen how his dugouts worked. She'd seen how the girl was saved with water and honey. She didn't trust him, but she respected him. Dan explained that he needed a hide, 1 in 1 piece, a large one. A deer or moose hide. Hanil listened. Then she asked why. He tried to explain. A stone with another stone hidden inside it. A red stone, hard and sharp. To get the red stone, you need a lot of fire. To make a lot of fire, you need wind. To make wind, you need a hide. Hanil looked at him as if he were crazy. But she brought a hide. A young deer. Her own kill. All her own. Dan sewed the bellows for 3 days. He sewed with sinew thread. He pricked his fingers until they bled. The stitching was rough but held the air. 2 wooden plates at the edge. When you squeeze the clamps, the bag collapses. When you release them, the bag inflates. Air escapes through a tube made of hollow reed. He attached the tube to the air intake of the new furnace. He had built the furnace specifically for smelting. It was smaller than a potter's kiln, but had thick walls made of a mixture of clay and sand. Inside was a crucible, a small, thick-walled pot containing pieces of copper ore that had been ground into fine gravel with a stone.
Charcoal was placed on top. He burned the charcoal separately, wood in a sealed pit with no air access. The result was black, light, brittle charcoal that burned hotter than firewood. Much hotter. The first smelting. Dan poured the charcoal into the furnace. He lit it. He began pumping the bellows. Mija helped. They took turns pumping. 1 hour. 2. 3. Their hands were burning. Their shoulders ached. The heat from the furnace beat down on their faces. The temperature inside was rising, but Dan didn't know by how much. He couldn't measure it. He could only watch the color of the walls. Red. Dark red. Orange. When the walls turned bright orange, he realized the temperature was close. Another hour. The walls turned white on the inside. He stopped pumping. He waited. He opened the furnace. The crucible stood inside, white hot. He pulled it out with a stick, carefully. He set it on a stone. He waited for it to cool. He peered inside. Slag, a gray, porous mass. Useless. A failure. He sat in front of the crucible and stared at the slag. Mija sat beside him. She was silent. Dung thought, what went wrong? The temperature. Perhaps it wasn't high enough. Or the ore was too low in copper content. Or the coal had burned out before the ore melted. Or he had misidentified the ore and it wasn't copper at all. No, the green patina was copper. He was sure of it. The problem was in the process. The second smelting would take place in 2 days. He changed 3 things. He ground the ore finer. He added more coal. He pumped the bellows longer and harder. By evening, he opened the crucible. Slag. Again. But at the bottom, right at the very bottom, beneath a layer of gray mass, a drop. A tiny drop of red metal, the size of a pinky fingernail. Dan pried it out with a stick. He placed it in the palm of his hand. It was heavy, dense, red with an orange sheen. Copper. He raised his hand toward the light. The drop glistened in his palm. He was crying. Tears streamed down his cheeks into the beard he hadn't shaved in 3 months. Mija looked at him and didn't understand. She saw the red drop. She saw his tears. She didn't understand the connection. She didn't know that this drop was the beginning. That from such drops would grow knives and axes and arrowheads and cauldrons and pipes and wheels and rails and bridges. That this drop was the first step from stone to metal, from millennia to centuries. Dan knew, and he wept because he knew. The third smelting yielded a lump of copper the size of a walnut. The fourth, 2 walnuts worth. Dan adjusted the variables with each attempt. Finer ore, more coal, longer blast, thicker crucible walls. By the 5th smelting, he had obtained a piece of copper the size of a finger, enough to try his hand at forging. He heated the copper over the coals until it glowed red and struck it with a stone. The copper flattened out, soft, malleable. Not like stone, which splinters and crumbles. The copper bent and took shape. He struck it again and again until he had a thin sheet, warped and uneven, but metallic. The first piece of metal in the history of this world. He took the sheet to Temu. The chieftain turned it over in his hands. He tried to bend it. It bent. He tried to break it. It didn't break. He tried to cut his skin with it. The edge was blunt. Temu placed the sheet on his knee and looked at Dan. His expression said he didn't like it, but he was waiting. Dan gestured with his fingers. Give me some more time. Copper was soft. Too soft for a cutting tool. Pure copper doesn't hold an edge. A knife made of pure copper would dull faster than a good flint one. He needed bronze. Copper plus tin.
an alloy harder than either of its components. Tin. Where to get tin? Dan walked along the river every morning, searching. Tin ore, cassiterite, dark, heavy grains in the river sand. He washed the sand in a pot like a gold prospector. He scooped it from the bottom. He swirled it around. He poured off the light sand. The heavy grains remained at the bottom. After a week, he had a handful of dark crystals. He wasn't sure. It could have been anything. Magnetite, garnet, black tourmaline. Impossible to determine without a lab. There was only one way: smelting. He added a handful of dark grains to the copper ore in the crucible. Smelting run number 6. 4 hours of bellows. Mija and Beko took turns pumping. Dan kept an eye on the furnace. The result? A lump of metal at the bottom of the crucible, but a different color. Not red, yellow, with a golden sheen. Heavy. Dan picked it up with tongs made of 2 sticks and placed it on a flat stone. He heated it over the coals. He struck it. The metal flattened, but not as easily as pure copper. It resisted. It sprang back. Dan hammered for an hour. The lump turned into a strip as long as a finger and as wide as 2 fingernails. He sharpened it on a stone, a wet, fine-grained stone from the stream. He sharpened it for half an hour. He ran his finger along the edge. Sharp. Very sharp. He took a piece of leather and cut it. The leather parted cleanly and easily. Bronze. It was bronze. A random alloy, an imprecise one. The proportions of copper and tin were unknown. But bronze, the alloy that had changed the history of his world 3,000 years ago. Now it was changing this one. Dan spent 2 days forging his first knife. He took his time. He heated it over coals. He struck it with a stone hammer with a wooden handle. The blade was as long as his palm. The handle was made of deer antler, wrapped in rawhide. When the hide dried, it would shrink and fit snugly. He sharpened the blade to razor sharpness. The knife lay in his palm, heavy, shiny, with a blade that caught the sunlight and cast a yellow glint onto the ground. He was supposed to give it to the chief. That was the custom. The first metal knife goes to the chief. It strengthens his authority. It shows respect. It's the right thing to do. Dan thought about it and didn't give it to the chief. He gave it to Mija, to the girl who, 10 months ago, had stood over him with a spear made from a charred stick, who had carried coal for him, who had molded pots from dawn till dusk, who had pumped the bellows until her shoulders went numb, who, not once in all those months, had asked for anything for herself. He handed her the knife in front of everyone, by the communal fire, in the evening, when the whole tribe was eating together. Mija looked at the knife, then at him, then back at the knife. She didn't understand. She thought he was asking her to pass the knife to someone else. Dung shook his head. He pointed at her. To you. Mija took the knife, with both hands, just as the old woman Sena had once taken her first pot. She held it and didn't move. The tribe watched. Temu watched. His face was inscrutable. The young hunters exchanged glances. A girl, an orphan, not the chief, not the best hunter, a girl who makes pots. Dan knew what he was doing. It was a matter of principle. A reward for those who work, not for the one in charge, not for the strong, for the one who put in the effort and time. He was setting a precedent for the future, and everyone had to see it. Temu saw it. The chief was wise. He understood. He didn't approve, but he understood. And he remained silent. Hanil stood by her tent and watched. There was a strange expression on her face. Not anger, not envy, something resembling interest. Dan noticed. He remembered. The next day, he began making a new kind of sling for Hanil. Her sling was woven from plant fibers.
The stone pouch was small and stiff. The stone rattled when she took aim. Her accuracy suffered. Dan carved a pocket out of soft leather, wide and oval. The stone fit snugly inside and didn't move. He left the straps woven but made them longer. A longer strap means more leverage. More leverage means a longer throw. He brought the sling to Hanil. She took it without a word. She turned it over in her hands. Then she went out to the clearing behind the camp. She picked up a stone, placed it in the pouch, spun it, threw it. The stone flew farther and more accurately than with her old sling. She felt it right away, in her arm, in the sound, in the way the stone vanished into the air before she could even blink. She threw a second one, a third, a fifth, a 10th. Each throw was more accurate than the last. The pocket held the stone. The long straps gave her a full swing. She stopped. She looked at Dan. He was standing 10 paces away, watching her grip. She was holding the sling correctly, but her elbow was rising too high during the swing. The release angle changed with every throw. Dan walked over. He showed her, not with words, with his hands. He took her by the elbow and gently lowered it 3 fingers lower. Hold it here, a steady angle, the same every time. Hanil froze. He was touching her arm. The man she'd considered a weakling, who couldn't hunt a deer and was afraid of blood. He was touching her arm and correcting a movement she'd been making her whole life. She should have gotten angry. She didn't, because he was right. She could feel that he was right. The next throw went exactly where she'd aimed. Right on target. No deviation. She lowered her hand, looked at Dan. For a long time. Then she said one word. "Thank you," and walked away. It was the first word she'd said to him in 10 months. The bronze went into the series. Slowly, painfully slowly. Each smelting yielded a small lump of metal. Each knife took 2 days to forge. Each blade was sharpened by hand. By the end of the first year, the tribe had 12 bronze knives, 3 axes, 7 spearheads. Not much. Insignificantly few compared to what was needed. But in a world where the best tool was a flint flake, even 12 bronze knives were a revolution. Hunters returned with their prey faster. Butchering a carcass took an hour instead of half a day. Hides were cut more evenly. Wood was cut more cleanly. Dan introduced a record-keeping system. Every bronze tool belonged to the tribe, not to an individual. To the tribe. Whoever received a knife was responsible for it. If you lost or broke it, you had to come forward and explain. Dan carved a mark on every knife, a simple symbol, a number, first, second, third. It was the first inventory in the history of the world. In the 13th month, Sena died. Dan knew it would happen. He had seen her growing weaker. He had seen how her hands, which had never trembled before, began to shake as she tended her pot of herbs. He had seen how she would sit down after just 5 steps, breathing heavily. He had seen how the cough that began in winter did not go away with the arrival of spring. 55 winters. In this world, that was a very old age. Her body had worn out. Her heart was tired. Her lungs wheezed. She knew. Dan knew. They both knew and didn't speak of it aloud. A week before the end, she called for him. Evening, the earthen hut. The stove crackled quietly. The light from the coals danced on the walls. Sena sat on a bed of animal skins, small, thin, like a withered branch that the wind had laid upon a rock. She asked him to sit down. He sat beside her. She took his hand. Her fingers were slender and hot. Heat. She was burning from within. She began to speak, slowly, with pauses to catch her breath. She told him about her children. Her first daughter, who died in the winter when she was 3. Her son, who fell from a tree while hunting and broke his neck. her second daughter, who died in childbirth, her third child, a boy who froze to death at night in the hut when she was 40, and she fell asleep and didn't add more wood to the fire. She spoke about him the longest. Her voice didn't tremble. She had cried out all her grief long ago. All that remained was a steady, quiet pain that lived within her like a second heart. Then she fell silent, for a long time. Then she said she was glad. Glad that her herbs were recorded on the tablets. Glad that Mija could read the symbols and would be able to teach others. Glad that not a single child had died this winter. That perhaps none would die next winter either. And that none would die 10 winters from now. Because the knowledge was no longer in her head. It was on the clay. It wouldn't die with her. She said this and smiled. For the first time in all those months, Dan saw her smile genuinely, not out of politeness, not out of habit, genuinely. She died 4 days later, at night, quietly. Dan sat beside her, holding her hand. Mija sat on the other side. Senna's breathing grew slower and slower. Then it stopped. Then she took one last breath, and she didn't breathe again. Her last word was the name she'd given Dan during their first month together. Son of the dirt. He heard it and squeezed her hand, but she couldn't feel it anymore. They buried her on the hill above the camp. Dan dug the grave himself. Baek-ho helped. Mi-ja stood nearby, holding an armful of dry grasses, the very ones from her stash. The whole tribe had come. Temu spoke the words. Heiran spoke the words. Dan remained silent. He stood over the grave and stayed silent for so long that people began to exchange glances. Then he bent down and placed a clay tablet on the stone above the grave. He had fired it the day before. Symbols were carved into the tablet, pictograms he had devised himself. The name Se-na, the first name recorded in the history of this world. The herbalist, the mother, the tribe's grandmother, the one who knew all the roots and all the leaves, the one who saved a stranger. He stood up and walked away from the hill, into the forest, alone. He sat down by a tree and wept, as he had never wept for his own parents, because his parents had died in a world where death was a mistake, an accident, something wrong. But here, death was the norm, the natural order of things. 1 in 5 children every winter. 55 winters. That was a feat. And the only thing he could do for her was to write down her name so that the stone would remember when all the living had forgotten. He returned by evening, in silence. He sat down by the stove. He took a clay tablet and a stylus, and began to write. Not the herbalist Se-na. That had already been recorded. He was writing something else. A list. The names of everyone in the tribe. 26 names. Next to each name, a symbol. Hunter, potter, builder, mother, child, elder. He wrote down everyone, every single one. The first census. Mi-ja sat nearby and watched. Then she asked quietly. He looked up. She said she wanted to write down 2 names, her parents, from the tribe that had been wiped out when she was 8. She had never told anyone. She had kept silent for 4 years. For 4 years, she had carried those names inside her, afraid she would forget them, that the sound would vanish from her memory, that her mother's and father's voices would dissolve like smoke. Dan gave her a stick. She didn't know how to write. He showed her. Symbol by symbol, she repeated them. Crooked, hesitantly. The first name, her mother. The second, her father. They sat side by side in the light of the stove and wrote the names of the dead on clay. When they were done, Mi-ja placed the tablet on her lap and stared at it for a long time. Then she said quietly,
Now they won't disappear. Dan nodded. She began to cry for the first time in 4 years. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the clay. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to comfort her. He sat beside her and remained silent, because no words were needed. The next morning, Dan stepped out of the dugout and saw Harem. The shaman was standing by Senna's grave on the hill, alone. He was looking at the nameplate. Dan walked up to him. He stood beside him. They were silent. The wind rustled the grass on the hillside. Harem spoke first. He said that Senna had been a strong woman, stronger than any man in the tribe. Dan agreed. Harem paused. Then he said that he knew about herbs too. Not as well as Senna, but he knew. He knew which root induces sleep, which one stops the bleeding, which berry cleanses the stomach of evil. Dan listened.
Haran said he could show them, if someone would write it down. It was an offer, not of friendship, not of a truce, a deal. The shaman saw the nameplate and understood. His knowledge, too, would die with him, unless someone wrote it down. Dan turned to face him. He looked into the tattooed face. This man had wanted to banish him. This man had ranted about the wrath of the spirits. This man had hated him for 6 months, and now he stood before him on the hill, offering his knowledge in exchange for immortality in clay. Dan held out his hand. Haran looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he shook it. In his world, that meant agreement. In Dan's world, too. He didn't kill the shaman. He didn't banish him. He didn't humiliate him. He repurposed him. From an enemy to a keeper of knowledge about herbs. Under the supervision of the record-keeping system that Dan controlled. It was the first political move, not the last. The end of the first year brought changes that Dan hadn't planned for. People began arriving at Tae-il's camp. Not enemies, not traitors. Refugees. The first 3 to arrive were a man and 2 women from the tribe upriver, the very same tribe that had wanted to trade for Dan a year ago. The man was limping. There were burn marks on his back, fresh ones. The women were thin and frightened. Taemu welcomed them by the campfire. The man spoke at length. Dan stood nearby and listened. He understood almost everything. Over the course of the year, his language skills had developed to the level of a teenager. Not every word, not every turn of phrase, but the gist. The gist was simple. Their tribe had been burned. Raiders from the north. Horsemen. The men were killed. The women were taken away. The children were thrown into the burning huts. 3 survived because they had been out hunting and returned to the ruins. The Gray Wolves. Dan heard that name for the first time, but the chill that ran down his spine was familiar. The chill of calculation. Horsemen. Horses. Organized violence. A coordinated attack. This wasn't a spontaneous raid. This was an army. A primitive one, but an army nonetheless. Taemu listened to the refugees and gave them a place in the camp. Dan approached the man later. He asked for details. How many horsemen? The man gestured with his hands. He opened and closed his fingers 3 times. 30. 30 horsemen had routed a tribe of 40 people. When did they arrive? 3 moons ago. From where? From the north. From the steppe beyond the mountains. Where did they go afterward? Further south, along the river. Dan sat by the stove that evening and thought. Sticks on the ground, not to keep track of food, to keep track of time. If the Gray Wolves traveled upriver 3 months ago and went further south, they'll return. Nomads always return. They move in circles, pastures, hunting grounds, rivers for watering the horses. In a season or 2, they'll pass through here again.
and they'll see the camp of brick houses on the hill, and smoke rising from clay chimneys. Steady smoke, the smoke of order. And for a nomad, order means prey. A week later, 5 more men arrived from another tribe further down the river. Same story: horsemen, fire, death. A month later, there were already 38 people in the Te'il camp instead of 26. More mouths to feed, but also more hands. Dan began building faster than before. The newcomers worked. They were grateful for a roof over their heads and food, and they worked tirelessly. Beko supervised the construction. 3 new houses in 2 months. Mija taught 2 women from among the refugees the art of pottery. Pot production doubled. Dan focused on iron. Yes, iron. He found it by accident, in a swamp across the river. Brown iron ore, limonite, reddish, crumbly stones that looked like solidified rust. He knew them. He'd seen them at festivals. A reenactor from Michigan used to bring such stones and smelt them in a homemade blast furnace in 2 hours. A blast furnace, not crucible smelting like with copper. A different principle. A shaft furnace, tall, narrow, ore and coal loaded in layers from the top. Air blown in from below through bellows. The ore doesn't melt completely. It's reduced. The carbon from the coal draws oxygen out of the ore. What remains is iron, porous, loose, mixed with slag, crude iron, a lump that needs to be hammered out. Knock out the slag with blows, over and over, heat, strike, until only pure metal remains. He built the furnace over 3 weeks, tall as a man, made of clay and sand, thick walls, 2 openings at the bottom for bellows, 2 bellows. 2 bellows operators, a continuous stream of air. The first smelting of iron was a big event. The whole village gathered. Temu stood and watched. Heidan stood next to him and watched too. Hanil stood slightly to the side with her arms crossed. Bekho and a young man from among the refugees pumped the bellows. Mija fed the coal. Dan loaded the ore and monitored the temperature. Hours. Heat, sweat, the roar of the fire in the shaft, sparks flying from the top opening. Slag flowed from the bottom like a thick orange river. They worked for 6 hours without a break. When Dan pried open the furnace with a bronze crowbar, a lump lay at the bottom. A shapeless lump the size of 2 fists. Red hot, white. He pulled it out with tongs he'd forged from bronze a week earlier. He placed it on a stone anvil, a flat granite boulder that Bekho had hauled from the river, and began to hammer it. A stone hammer with a wooden handle. A blow. Sparks. Slag spattered in all directions in hot droplets. Another blow. The lump flattened. Slag oozed out of it like water from a sponge. He heated it. He struck it. He heated it. He struck it. An hour. 2. 3. By evening, a piece of metal lay on the anvil, gray, heavy, with a matte sheen. Iron. Not bronze. Iron. Harder, stronger. Cheaper to produce because the bog ore lay within a half-hour's walk, while copper and tin had to be sought out in the rocks. Dan forged his first iron axe in 4 days. The blade, the socket for the handle, an oak handle, a wedge. He walked over to a tree at the edge of the clearing, a young ash tree as thick as a thigh. He swung. He struck. The axe sank 3 fingers deep into the wood. A stone axe would have sunk half a finger deep. After 10 strikes, the ash tree began to lean. After 20, it fell. Temu stood nearby. He looked at the stump, at the smooth, clean cut, at the tree that the man had spent half a day felling with a stone axe, while the stranger had felled it in the time it took to smoke a pipe of dried moss. The chief held out his hand.
Dan handed him the axe. Temu weighed it in his hand. He took aim. He struck the trunk of the fallen tree. A splinter the length of a palm flew off. Temu looked at the axe, at Dan, and for the first time ever, he smiled. Not the chieftain's polite smile, a genuine one, like a child who'd been given a toy he never knew he could dream of. News of the iron spread through the valley in a matter of days, like wildfire through dry grass. The tribe by the T'il River makes stone that cuts stone. That's what they called it, stone that cuts stone, because they had no word for metal. Dan gave them a word, in his own language of symbols and pictograms. The symbol for iron looked like an inverted triangle with a line through it. A month later, messengers arrived at the camp. 3 men from the tribe south of the river. Not refugees, envoys. The chief of the southern tribe had sent a proposal. He wanted the stone that cut stone. He was willing to offer grain, salted fish, hides, women. Dan listened. Then he asked, "How many people are in your tribe?" The envoys exchanged glances. The eldest held up his hands. A long time. About 80. Dan looked at Temu. The chief was looking at him. They were both thinking the same thing. 80 people. Add that to 38 and it's more than 100. 100 people isn't a tribe anymore. It's a settlement. It's walls. It's a garrison. It's a chance to hold out when the gray wolves return. Dan told the envoys that he wasn't selling axes. He was offering something else. Let your chief come himself. Let's talk. The envoys left. A week later, the chief of the southern tribe arrived. 20 men were with him, warriors and women. His name was Gon Yu, a large man with a gray beard and intelligent eyes. He looked at the brick houses, at the stoves with chimneys, at the pots and knives and axes, at the iron furnace smoking on the hillside. He looked and said nothing. Then he sat down by the fire across from Dan. The negotiations with Gon Yu lasted 3 days. The chief of the southern tribe turned out to be a difficult man. He took his time. He didn't pressure them. He sat by the fire and asked questions. Calm, precise questions that revealed a mind sharper than a bronze knife hidden beneath his gray beard. He asked why Dan didn't simply want to sell the axes. Dan replied that a single tribe with axes was a target. 2 tribes with axes were a wall. Gon Yu nodded. Then he asked who would be in charge of the alliance. Temu was sitting nearby, and Dan could sense his tension. That question had been hanging in the air from the very first minute. Dan answered, "Each chief remains the chief of his own tribe. Internal affairs, hunting, families, disputes between neighbors. The chief decides all of this, just as before. But there are matters that concern everyone. Walls, weapons, winter supplies, trade with other tribes, war. For these matters, a council is needed. 2 chiefs and Dan, 3 votes. A decision is made when 2 out of 3 agree." Gon Yu listened. Then he asked, "And who are you?" "Not a chief, not a hunter, not a shaman. Who are you to sit alongside the chiefs?" Dan had been pondering this question for a long time. He knew that in this world, there was no word for what he was. There's no concept of an engineer, no concept of an advisor, no concept of a minister. There's a chief who leads. There's a shaman who speaks with the spirits. There's a hunter who provides food. And that's it. He came up with a new word, senior master. The one who makes things. The one who teaches how to make things. The one who decides what things are needed. Not a chief, not above the chief. Beside him. A different role. Gon Yu looked at Temu. Temu looked at Dan. A long look. Chief Ta'il wasn't stupid. He understood that Dan could have demanded power. The axes and knives gave him the strength that would make any chief the chief of chiefs. But he didn't demand it. He asked for a place beside him. Not above, beside. Temu nodded. Gon-U looked at both of them. He grunted and held out his hands, palms up. Agreement. The alliance was sealed on the 4th day. No paper, no seal. Gon-U and Temu exchanged knives. An ancient ritual. My knife in your hands means my life is in your hands. Dan added something new, a clay tablet. The terms of the alliance were inscribed on it in pictograms. 2 tribes, a joint council, shared walls, shared iron, shared defense. Gon-U looked at the tablet and didn't understand the symbols, but he understood the meaning. It was something solid, something that wouldn't change if one of them forgot or lied. Stone remembers. He pressed his palm against the wet clay. Temu pressed his. Dan pressed a third. 3 fingerprints. The first treaty in the history of the world. For the next 2 months, Dan didn't sleep. Or so it seemed. Gon-U's tribe crossed the river and settled near Te-Il. 82 people, plus 38. 120 mouths to feed. 120 pairs of hands. Dan began building a wall, an earthen rampart around the settlement. A moat in front of the rampart, a palisade on top of the rampart, sharpened ash stakes driven into the packed earth. Bekho supervised the earthwork. His crew had grown to 15 men. They dug the moat along the outline Dan had marked out, a semicircle, the open side facing the river. The river itself served as a barrier. The moat was as deep as a man's height and 3 paces wide. The earth dug from the moat was piled onto the rampart. They tamped it down with their feet and logs. It was heavy, monotonous work, every day from dawn to dusk. But the men worked because the refugees had told them what happens when there are no walls. Dan did the calculations, the perimeter, the amount of wood needed for the palisade, the number of stakes, the distance between them, how deep to drive them in. He drew diagrams on clay tablets. Bekho would pick up the tablets in the morning, and by evening, the section was ready. They didn't talk much. They understood each other through their work, through the numbers on the clay, through the sticks stuck in the ground as markers. While the wall was being built, Dan worked on weapons, iron spearheads, in batches of 10. He taught 2 young men from the Gonyu tribe how to forge. They proved to be talented. One of them could forge a spearhead in half a day. A month later, the alliance had 60 spears with iron tips, 20 axes, 10 knives. Hanil came to him in the 6th week. She stood by the forge and watched the young men forge. Then she turned to Dan and said she needed tips for slings, not stones. Stones fly well, but are uneven and unpredictable. She needed identical projectiles, of the same weight, of the same shape, so that every throw would be just like the one before. Dan looked at her. She spoke like an engineer. She didn't know the word, but she thought like an engineer. Repeatability, standardization, control of variables. He cast 20 lead balls for her. No, not lead. Clay. Fired in the same mold. Round, identical. Each the size of a walnut. Each the same weight. Hanil took one. She weighed it in her palm, placed it in the sling, spun it, threw it. The clay ball flew straight, precisely, without wavering in the air. It hit the tree 30 paces away, exactly where she had aimed. She threw the second one. Hit. The third. She hit it. She lowered the sling and looked at Dan. There was something in her eyes that he was seeing for the first time. Not respect, not gratitude. Recognition. She saw in him the same thing she saw in herself. Precision. Calculation. The understanding that every little detail matters. She sat down next to him by the hearth. without asking permission, and she began to speak. For the first time, she spoke to him freely about hunting, about how to read tracks, how to determine the distance to the prey by the depth of the footprint, how to tell by the wind which way the herd would go. She thought in numbers. She didn't know they were numbers, but she had been counting steps and angles and distances every day her whole life. Dan listened and understood. She was just like him, just in a different field. He built bridges. She killed from a distance. Both of them calculated variables. That evening, for the first time, he saw her face without any wariness. She sat by the fire and told him how she once hit a hawk in flight with a stone. Her voice was different, not harsh, alive. The scar across her eyebrow twitched as she squinted, recalling the moment. Dan watched and thought she was beautiful. Not like the girls in Seattle, in a different way. Like a well-crafted tool, precise, functional, without anything superfluous. Then he stopped himself. Not now. The walls were more important. By the end of the 15th month, the wall was complete, a semicircle stretching from river to river, a moat, a rampart, a palisade, 3 gates with rotating log doors. Inside the perimeter stood 14 houses, the horn workshop, the warehouse, the communal meeting house. 120 people lived within the walls. Dan stood on the rampart and looked down at the settlement from above. The straight lines of the houses, smoke rising from the chimneys, women by the stream, children on the playground, men by the horn. This was no longer a tribe. It was something new, something that didn't yet have a name in this world. Hanil stood beside him. A sling hung from her belt. The wind ruffled her braid. She was looking too. Then she said quietly, "My brother wouldn't have frozen to death here." Dan didn't answer, but he remembered. In the 16th month, Dan climbed into the mountains. He was looking for a cave. The dreams wouldn't leave him alone. Someone else's dreams, not his own. A woman in a dark space, stone walls, cold, the smell of dampness and something chemical, something blue on her shoulders. He'd had these dreams 3 or 4 times over the past few months. Every time, the same thing. Darkness, stone, the color blue, and a feeling that didn't belong to him. Shame. The deep, searing shame of a man who had given up. Dan didn't believe in the supernatural. He was an engineer. But he found himself in a world where he wasn't supposed to be, in a body that wasn't his own, and arguing with the reality of the dreams seemed foolish. He took backhoe with him. 2 days of climbing along rocky trails. They spent the night by the fire, wrapped in animal skins. On the second day, Dan saw the entrance, a crevice in the rock blocked by stones. The stones weren't scattered the way they would be after a rock slide. Someone had stacked them, by hand. They cleared the blockage in 3 hours. Inside, the air smelled musty and of something else, something familiar, plastic, synthetic material, a scent that didn't exist in this world. Dan stepped inside. A torch made of oiled cloth on a stick cast flickering light across the walls. The cave was small, 3 steps deep, with a low ceiling. Bones lay on the floor. A human skeleton, small, female. Next to it was a decayed piece of blue fabric. Dan crouched down. He lifted the edge of the fabric. It crumbled in his hands, but he managed to see it. A logo. Letters in Cyrillic. Something about an expedition. The year, 74. 3 objects lay next to the skeleton. A notebook. Its imitation leather cover was cracked and faded. A rusty compass. The needle was firmly rusted to the glass. And a piece of metal. Melted, shapeless, but metal. Not bronze and not iron. Something else. Aluminum or stainless steel. Something that couldn't possibly exist here and now. Dan opened the notebook. The pages were stuck together and yellowed. Most of the text was illegible. Water stains had corroded the ink, but the last page was better preserved than the others. The handwriting was small and neat. Russian. Dan didn't read Russian, but he recognized one word: coordinates, numbers, and a phrase at the bottom of the page written in larger letters than the rest, as if the hand had been trembling. He couldn't read it, but he memorized the shape of every letter. He carved them with a stick into the clay right there in the cave. He copied them. Bako stood at the entrance and said nothing. He didn't understand what was happening. He saw the bones and unfamiliar objects, and his face was ashen. Dead bodies in a cave are bad. Dead bodies left unburied are very bad. Dan gathered the bones, carefully. He wrapped them in the hide he'd brought with him. He put the notebook and compass in his bag, the metal too. They carried the remains outside. They buried her on the hillside under a large rock. Dan didn't know her name. He couldn't read it. But he knew she had been here. Another person from another time. From the year 1974. A woman, a geologist, alone, in this world, just like him. Only she had been here 30 years longer, judging by the state of things. 30 years, alone, in a cave in the mountains. And she died, without building anything. The return trip took a day and a half. Dan was silent the whole way. He was thinking. He wasn't the first. Someone had already been there. Someone had tried and failed. Why? She was a geologist. She knew rocks and ores. She could have found copper and iron faster than he did. She knew, but she didn't. Why? The shame from her dreams. That very same shame. She gave up. Loneliness and fear broke her before she even had a chance to begin. She went into the mountains and hid. She survived for 30 years like a wild animal. She ate roots and small game. She hid from people. And she died alone in the darkness. Dan could feel this story in his bones because he understood how close he'd come to the same fate in the early days, when he lay by the fire under the stars and could have gotten up and walked into the forest and never come back. The difference between him and her lay in a single pot, in a single old woman who sniffed his hair and decided not to kill him, in a single piece of dried meat placed at his feet. A coincidence. He returned to the settlement. That evening, he sat by the hearth and stared at the fire for a long time. Then he took out a clay tablet with letters copied from his notebook, a copied phrase. He couldn't read it, but he would find someone who could, or she would find him. A month later, a third tribe joined the settlement, a small one, 30 people. Their chief crawled up to the gates with a battered face. The gray wolves had swept through his territory a week ago. They took everything. Dan took him in. He gave them a place inside the walls. Then a fourth tribe arrived, and a fifth. By the 20th month, more than 200 people lived in the settlement, a union of 5 tribes. Dan introduced a writing system, 28 pictograms, simple, clear. Each represented a syllable or a concept. They formed words. The words formed phrases. From phrases came records. Mija became the first teacher. She taught the children to draw symbols on wet clay. Every morning, 10 children sat in a row before her and scratched squiggles onto the tablets with sticks. The first school. Young Ah arrived in the 19th month, the daughter of the Blackwater tribe's chief, given as a hostage to seal the alliance, her father's condition for entering into the treaty. She arrived at the settlement with her back straight and a stony expression. Tall, beautiful, with a cold, aloof beauty. She didn't cry, she didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything.
She sat in the house set aside for her and remained silent. 3 days. Dan came to see her on the 4th. He sat across from her. She looked right through him. He said he needed an interpreter, someone who knew the sign language of the 3 tribes. He'd heard she knew it. She looked at him. For the first time in 4 days, she looked at a living person. He said this wasn't a request. It was a job. A real job. With a real seat on the council. Not a hostage. A negotiator. A voice that speaks for herself. Yun-Ah listened. Her face didn't change. But something shifted in her eyes. A tiny spark. A tiny crack in the stone wall behind which she had been hiding her whole life. The 22nd month brought Grace Ree. The girl arrived with the 5th tribe, 14 years old, the blacksmith's daughter. Although the word blacksmith here meant someone who strikes stone against stone to make a spearhead, not a blacksmith as Dan understood the term. But her father had the right hands, and so did she. Dan saw her on her first day at the forge. She stood there watching the smelting process, her mouth agape. Not out of fear, out of eagerness. She wanted this. She wanted the fire and the metal and the process. She wanted it the way children want what is to become their life. He called her over. She approached without hesitation. She looked up at him and asked what that red stone inside the furnace was. Dan explained. Ore. A stone with metal hidden inside. The fire draws the metal out. She nodded. Then she asked if she could try. He gave her a hammer, a bronze one, a small one, for fine work. He placed a heated piece of iron on the anvil. He showed her how to strike it. She struck it. Crooked. Weakly. He corrected her grip. She struck again. Better. The 3rd strike was precise. The 4th, too. She kept striking, without stopping. He watched her and saw something he hadn't seen in anyone else in the tribe. Absolute concentration. Complete absorption in the process. She forgot where she was standing, forgot who was beside her. She was wholly immersed in the work. Half an hour later, he stopped her. She lifted her head. Her cheeks were red from the heat. Her eyes were shining. He asked her name. She answered, Grace Ree. His knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the anvil and stood there for a few seconds, holding his breath. The girl looked at him in bewilderment. She didn't know. She couldn't have known that in another world, in another life, there had been a girl with that name. His sister. The one he video called every Sunday. The one who laughed when he showed her his knives from the garage. The one who said he was a crazy blacksmith trapped in an engineer's body. Grace. A coincidence. A fluke. Sounds that mean nothing in a world without the English language. But his body wouldn't listen to his mind. His body remembered. He straightened up, took a breath, looked at the girl. She was waiting. He said, "Come tomorrow." She came every day, without fail. In the morning, she was standing by the forge before anyone else. She left in the evening after everyone else, covered in soot and with burned fingers. Her father came to see Dan a week later, a large, grim man with hands that could snap Dan's neck in a single motion. He said that a woman at the forge was a curse, that his daughter was bringing shame upon him, that fire wasn't for girls. Dan listened. Then he turned toward the forge, where Grace Ree was forging her 3rd tip. Smooth, symmetrical, better than anything either of his male apprentices had made. He turned to his father and said in front of everyone standing around, "She is my second master. Whoever is against her is against me." His father was silent. He looked at Dan. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the tip in her hands. He turned and walked away.
Grace Reese stood by the furnace with the tip in her tongs. She had heard everything. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply went back to work. But her back was straighter, and the hammer blows rang out more clearly. She had a gift. Dan saw it more clearly with each passing day. A perfect memory for proportions. He'd shown her the ratio of copper to tin for bronze just once. 9-1. She remembered it. Forever. She never asked again. She never made a mistake again. A month later, she was forging knives that were smoother than his own. 2 months later, she was making things he couldn't. Thin bronze sewing needles, fishing hooks, clothing fasteners. Little things that would change daily life imperceptibly and inexorably. Dan looked at her and saw the future. Not his own. Hers. She would outlive him. She would forge when he could no longer. And she would teach the next generation. And they would teach the next. A chain. Continuity. The very reason all of this had been set in motion. By the 24th month, Yuna had become the center of the Alliance's diplomacy. She spoke with the ambassadors of the 5 tribes in a sign language that everyone understood. She drafted treaties on clay tablets. She settled disputes between families from different tribes. Coolly, precisely, fairly. Dan watched. She never raised her voice, never made threats. She asked questions, the same questions Dan asked. What happened? Who was hurt? What was needed to prevent it from happening again? She learned from him. He didn't teach her on purpose. She watched, listened, and absorbed it all. One evening, she signed a treaty with the 6th tribe. Not on Dan's behalf, not on Temu's behalf, on her own behalf. The Alliance's chief negotiator. She pressed her palm against the wet clay and sat gazing at that imprint long after the envoys had left. Dan saw her. He didn't approach. He knew she needed to be alone with it. For 22 years, she had been a thing. The chief's daughter, a pawn in a deal, a commodity. For the first time in her life, she was herself. It was her imprint, her name, her decision. By the 25th month, the alliance consisted of 6 tribes, nearly 300 people. Dan built an irrigation ditch from the river to the fields. The barley shared by the southern tribe yielded its first harvest, twice as much as without irrigation. A brick granary, the first regular militia, 100 men and 20 women. Hanil commanded the slingers. Bekho commanded the spearmen. Training every morning, formations, maneuvers, a wall of shields. Everything according to Dan's drawings on clay tablets. He didn't know how to fight, but he knew how to read. And he remembered how the Roman legions were organized, not in detail, but in principle. Formation defeats the mob. Discipline defeats bravery. A wall of shields defeats lone horsemen. And it was at that very moment that the first reconnaissance party of the Grey Wolves arrived. 5 horsemen appeared at dawn. They stood on a hill across the river and looked at the settlement. Dan saw them from the rampart. Horses. Real horses. Short, shaggy, with thick legs. The rider sat on them without saddles, just hides, but they sat confidently, as if it were second nature, as if they'd grown up on these horses. One of them raised his hand and pointed at the smoke rising from the chimneys, then at the walls, then at the moat. They watched for a long time. Then 3 of them turned their horses around and rode off to the north. 2 remained. They rode down to the river. They rode slowly along the bank, studying it. Then they too turned around and left. Hanil stood on the rampart next to Dan, a sling in her hand. She could have reached them. The distance was pushing it, but she could have. Dan placed his hand on her wrist. No, not now. If we kill them, others will come, and they'll know we're hostile.
Let them go. Let them report what they saw, the walls, the moat, and the smoke. Let them wonder. Ha-Nil lowered her arm, but she didn't let go of the sling. Dan began to prepare. He had time. Not much. Maybe 3 months. Maybe 6. The scouts would return to their chieftain. They'd tell him about the settlement beyond the walls. The chieftain would think it over. He'd gather his forces. He'd march. The journey from the steppes to the Te-Il Valley takes several weeks, maybe a month. Time. Every day meant another arrowhead, another shield, another section of the wall. He worked harder than ever. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate on the go. He oversaw 3 construction sites at once. The wall around the settlement grew taller, a double palisade. Between the rows of stakes lay rammed earth mixed with stones. The moat grew deeper and wider. Sharpened stakes were driven into the bottom. In front of the moat lay an open area. He had cut down all the trees and bushes within 100 paces of the wall. A clear field. No cover for attackers. He chose a battlefield. Not near the walls, further away. A 2-hour walk to the north. 2 hills stood on either side of a narrow valley through which the only trail from the pass ran. If the Grey Wolves headed for Te-Il, they would take this trail, between the hills. Dan walked through the valley for 3 days. He measured it in paces. He sketched it on a tablet. He calculated the angles of fire, the distances, the blind spots. He returned to the settlement and began to dig. A ditch across the valley. Not deep, knee-deep for a horse. Deep enough for a horse to stumble. Camouflaged with branches and earth. Behind the ditch was a palisade. Not continuous, but with narrow passages, just wide enough for a single horse. If a rider made it across the ditch, he would enter a passage where spearmen awaited him on both sides. If he stopped before the ditch, he would be standing in an open area under fire from both hills. Dan had built fortifications on the hills, low stone walls. Behind them were slingers and archers. Ha-Nil commanded the right hill. Baek-Ho stood in the center, behind the palisade, with the spearmen. Dan explained the plan on charts. He drew arrows. He showed who was moving where, when, and why. This wasn't a warrior's tactic. It was an engineering diagram. Every man in his place, every action tied to a signal, a system of flags. A red rag on a stick meant stand still. White meant move forward. 2 white ones meant retreat. Simple signals, visible from afar. They trained for 3 weeks, every day. Formation, reorganization, retreat on signal, attack on signal. Baek-Ho hammered this into his men just as he hammered stones into the foundation. Steadily, methodically, without shouting. Ha-Nil drilled the slingers until every one of them could hit the target from 30 paces, 8 out of 10 throws. Grace Ree forged arrowheads without stopping. The forge burned day and night. Yun-Ah traveled among the tribes of the Alliance, gathering people. Every chieftain was required to send warriors. It was a condition of the treaty, mutual defense. The Grey Wolves arrived in the 29th month. Dan was standing on the right hill when he saw dust on the horizon. Then he heard it, a dull, steady rumble. 1,000 hooves on dry ground. They emerged from behind the pass in a long column. Horsemen, many of them. Dan counted. He counted for a long time. His hands were shaking, but he kept counting. About 1,000, maybe more. 1,000 horsemen against his 120 fighters behind the stockade and on the hills. He looked at the chart in his hands, a diagram, arrows, numbers. Everything had been calculated. The ditch, the stockade, flanking fire from the hills, an ambush in the grove behind the left hill. Everything had been decided months earlier. When he was digging the ditch, when he was forging the spearheads, when he was teaching his men drill.
Dan's heroism was a matter of preparation. He was winning through past labor, not present feats. The column was approaching. Riding at the front was a horseman larger than the rest, on a gray horse, with a wolf pelt draped over his shoulders. Kirkan. Dan didn't know his name. He found out later, but even from a distance, he could tell. The chieftain. The one who first tamed the horse. The one who united the steppe tribes into a single force. A genius in his own right, just like Dan, only on the other side. The column stopped at the edge of the valley. Kirkan saw the hills, the moat, the palisade, people on the walls. He didn't rush into an attack. He thought. For half an hour, his horsemen stood motionless and waited. Then Kirkan rode forward, alone, right up to the moat. He looked down. He looked at the stakes, at the palisade, at the hills. He raised his head and saw Dan on the hill to the right. They looked at each other across a distance of 100 paces. Kirkan shouted. Yun-Ah stood next to Dan and translated. He says you're just like him, that you both see things that aren't there. He says, come with me and we'll take over this world in 2 years. Dan looked at the man on the gray horse, at the wolf pelt, at the confident, calm face. He understood. Kirkan was right. They were the same. Two people who saw further than others. Two men who were building a future out of nothing. Only one was building walls, while the other was building fear. Dan shook his head. No. Kirkan watched for another second. He nodded, with regret. Genuine regret. Then he turned his horse around and gave the signal. They attacked in waves. The first wave, 200 horsemen charged head-on down the valley. The horses plunged into the ditch. Those in front fell. Those behind crashed into those in front. Screams, neighs, dust. Those who leaped over the ditch crashed into the palisade. Passages, as narrow as the neck of a bottle. One horseman after another, and spears on both sides. Iron spearheads pierced the horse's unprotected flanks and the rider's legs. Dan raised a white flag. The slingers on the hills opened fire. Clay balls whistled through the air and struck the heads and shoulders of the horsemen standing before the ditch. Ha-Nil's shots were precise. Every throw hit its mark. The second wave veered left, trying to go around the hill. There was a grove there, and 30 spearmen were waiting in the grove. The horsemen charged into the trees, where the horses could not turn around. Spears emerged from behind every tree trunk. The third wave did not advance. Kirkan called his men back. They retreated beyond the pass. Bodies lay on the field in front of the ditch, men and horses. Dan stood on the hill and counted. His hands were shaking, not from fear. He was counting the casualties, his own. 11 killed, 23 wounded. Enemy casualties? Over 100 horses, 60 or 70 riders. As he counted, he felt sick to his stomach. He had never seen so many dead. He had never seen a horse die. He turned away and vomited onto the rocks. Ha-Nil stood beside him. She said nothing. She offered no comfort. She just stood there. The next day, Kirkan attacked again, with a different tactic. He dismounted some of the horsemen and sent the infantry to storm the hills. Dan had been expecting this. During the night, Bekho had hauled the rocks up the slope. When the infantry began climbing the slope, boulders rained down on them. The assault faltered. By noon, the Grey Wolves had retreated. By evening, they were gone. Completely. The dust on the horizon dissipated, and the valley fell silent. Dan found Kirkan's body on the third day, by the ditch. A clay ball thrown by Ha-Nil had struck him in the temple during the second assault. He lay in the dust. A wolf pelt was under his head. His face was serene, as if he were thinking. Dan stood over him for a long time. Then he ordered him to be buried separately,
on a hill, with respect, with his weapons, as one buries an equal. Because Kher Khan was the only person in this world who saw right through him. A year had passed since the battle. 3 years had gone by since the day Dan opened his eyes amid the fallen leaves and saw 3 pairs of legs looming over him. The city stood there, Tae Il Sun, the city by the bright river. That was the name chosen at the Council of the 6 Chiefs, and Dan had no objection. Stone walls 2 human heights high, straight streets paved with flat river stones, a water supply system of fired clay pipes running from the upper stream to the central square. The water flowed through the pipes on its own. Gravity. A slope of 2 fingers for every 10 steps. The Roman standard. Dan knew it by heart. A public bathhouse. A building with 3 stone baths fed by pipes carrying water heated in boilers on stoves. Hot water. For everyone. Free of charge. He built the bathhouse first, right after the walls, because cleanliness is health, and health means children who don't die. 10,000 people. He repeated that number and still couldn't believe it. 10,000. 6 tribes had become 1 people. People came on their own, from beyond the mountains, from the south, from the east. Rumors of a city with iron and hot water and houses with windows spread through the valleys and mountain passes like the wind. And people followed those rumors, in families, entire clans. Dan stood on the wall and looked down. The square. Morning. The sun was still low and the shadows were long. Children were in the square. Dozens of children. They were playing a game they'd made up themselves. Some were building a tower out of clay bricks. Others were counting the bricks as sticks. They were arguing over who would build and who would count. They didn't know they were repeating the story of his life. Hanil stood next to him. A little girl sat in her arms. A tiny girl, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's straight nose. Dan's daughter. She was 4 months old. She was born in winter in a warm house with a stove and a chimney. Mija delivered the baby following Sena's instructions written on clay tablets. Everything went well. Hanil refused to stay in bed on the second day. She got up, swaddled the baby, went out to check on the guards on the wall. That was just how she was. She hadn't changed. She hadn't softened. She had just grown broader. She could hold her daughter in one arm and, with the other, hurl a stone at a target 30 paces away. Dan saw it. He wasn't surprised. Yun-Ah stood a little lower down the stairs. In her hands was a fresh tablet, the treaty with the 7th tribe, the last major tribe in the valley. She had signed it yesterday. Her palm print was imprinted on the clay. Her name. She was no longer a hostage. She was the voice of the alliance. When the envoys came to the walls, they didn't ask for Chief Temu. They asked for Yun-Ah. Because she spoke calmly and precisely, and every word she uttered was weighed like a counterweight on a scale. Dan trusted her completely. She knew that. And that trust was the only thing that broke down the wall inside her. Slowly, stone by stone. Grace Rhee appeared from below. She climbed the ladder up to the wall, covered in soot, her hands black up to her elbows, her eyes gleaming. She had just finished smelting, a new batch. She had been experimenting with the composition, adding coal to the iron. She didn't know what made steel, but she did it. The results varied. Sometimes the blade turned out harder than usual, sometimes more brittle. She wrote down every proportion on a tablet. She systematized it. She looked for a pattern. Dan didn't interfere. She did it on her own. She thought for herself. She was who he wanted her to be. Not a copy, not a shadow. A master in her own right who would go beyond her teacher. She was 15. In 10 years, she would know more about metal than he did. In 20, she would be teaching people who would, in turn, teach others. A chain. That very one. Mija was downstairs, in the square. The school gathered every morning under a canopy of cloth and poles. 20 children, 20 pairs of hands holding sticks, 20 tablets. Mija walked between the rows and checked the marks. She adjusted their grip on the sticks. She showed them how to draw a line. Quiet. Patient. That very same 10-year-old girl with a spear made from a charred stick who had watched the stranger among the fallen leaves and hadn't stabbed him, who had sat next to the pit for 6 hours while the first pot burned, who, not once in 3 years, had asked for anything for herself. She had grown up. She was 19. The best potter. The first teacher. The keeper of the records. She remembered the names on the plaque they'd written together that night after Senna's death. Her parents' names. The plaque stood on a shelf at the school, the first exhibit in the first library. Dan looked at it all, at the walls, at the houses, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the children in the square, at Hanil holding her daughter in her arms, at Yun-Ah with the plaque, at Grace Ree covered in soot, at Mija among the students, at the hill outside the city where Sana lay beneath a rock, and pictograms were carved into the rock, the first name in the history of the world. He thought about continuity, about how these walls would stand for 100 years, that the signs at the school would last even longer, that the children who were now arguing over bricks would grow up and build other cities. And in those cities, there would be other schools. And in those schools, they would teach the symbols he had invented during his first month, sitting next to the old woman who had sniffed his hair. He thought about Grace, about the real Grace, about the sister from another life whom he video called every Sunday. He didn't know if she existed somewhere. He didn't know if there was another world beyond this sky. He didn't know if he had been transported or recreated, or if it was all a dream of a dying brain in a crumpled sedan on a wet highway. He didn't know, and he couldn't find out. But there was one thing he could do. He could build so that in 300 years, people here would read books. So that in 500 years, people here would build bridges, real bridges, made of stone and steel, across rivers he'd only ever seen on the horizon. So that if, in some sense, Grace existed, she would recognize him in these people, in the little girl counting bricks, in the woman placing her palm on a clay contract, in the craftsman at the kiln who isn't afraid of fire. He said it out loud, quietly, to no one in particular. Grace, I built a bridge. Grace Ree, standing nearby, didn't realize if he was addressing her. She raised her head, looked up at him, soot on her cheek, a sparkle in her eyes, and she smiled. She didn't know what that word meant to him, that a bridge isn't stone or metal, that a bridge is the distance between one world and another, between one life and another, between one person in the fallen leaves and 10,000 people behind stone walls. She just smiled, and that was enough. At that moment, a shadow slowly passed across the clear sky from the north, emerging from behind the mountains, a shadow with no source. It glided over the city like a hand. It passed over the rooftops, across the square filled with children, and along the walls, then vanished beyond the southern horizon. No one noticed, no one except one person. Emily was standing below at the gate. She had come to the town 3 months ago. She had come down from the mountains, aged, wild, but alive. Dan found her after the cave. He went back up into the mountains. He searched for 3 days. He found her in a crevice where she had lived for the past 30 years. He said 4 words to her in English. I need a geologist. She looked at him for a long time, a very long time. Then she began to cry, not out of happiness, out of shame. That very same shame from other people's dreams. She gave up. She had lived in the mountains for 30 years and hadn't even tried. And he had built a city in 3 years. Dan didn't reproach her with a single word. He said, "Show me where the ore is." She followed him down, into the valley, and on her first evening in the city, she washed herself in hot water. In the bathhouse he had built. Hot water that someone had heated especially for her. She sat in the stone tub, crying and laughing at the same time. 30 years. 30 years without hot water, without a human voice speaking a language she understood, without washing, without soap, without warmth. Now she stood at the gate, holding the first geographical map of the valley in her hands. She had drawn it over the course of 2 months. Rivers, mountains, ore deposits, passes, trails, everything she remembered from 30 years of solitary wandering. The map was rough, inaccurate, but it was a map, the first map in the history of the world. Emily looked up at the sky, at the shadow that had already vanished. Her face changed. She recognized it. She had seen it before, long ago, 30 years ago, in a cave in the mountains, when those without faces would come at night. She silently climbed the ladder up the wall. She walked over to Dan. She took his hand. He looked at her. Her eyes were serious, tired, alive. She said one sentence, in Russian. Then she repeated it in English. "It knows you're here." Dan looked up at the clear sky. Empty, blue, not a single cloud. The shadow was gone, but it had been there, and it would return. He knew it. Something in this world was resisting what he was doing. Something didn't want there to be walls and books and hot water here. Something had kept humanity in the Stone Age for thousands of years and had no intention of letting go. Dan squeezed Emily's hand. He looked at the city, at the walls, at the children, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the hill where Sana lay beneath the stone bearing her name, at everything he had built over the past 3 years with his hands, his mind, his stubbornness, and his love. Then he turned to Emily and said, "Let it come. We'll keep building." Down in the square, Mija called the children to class. Grace Ree went down to the bell and pumped the bellows. Baekho led the crew to the eastern wall to finish building the new section. Hanil took her daughter more securely in her arms and went to check on the guard. Yoon-ah sat down at the table and began drafting a new contract. The city was alive. The city was breathing. The city was working. Dan stood on the wall and watched the sun rise over the mountains. A new day. One of thousands yet to come. He didn't know what lay ahead. He didn't know what shadows the coming year would bring. He didn't know if he would live to old age in the city he had designed. But he knew one thing. The bridge stands. And as long as the bridge stands, the road is open. And as long as the road is open, someone will always walk along it further.